The French and Indian War, incredibly important war in the history of the United States. Actually, the French and Indian War was a series of 4 wars. Technically, the last war was the French and Indian War, and a major cause of the American Revolution. We'll talk about that later. For many years, over 100 years, the French as well as the British claimed land, and here we see warfare on the frontier. A great many people died. Native Americans as well as British settlers, Scottish, Irish, so on. The number of dead will never be known. Most deaths took place in lonely outposts on the frontier. Many people were kept captive, adopted into Native American tribes. Some were held for hostage. Some were killed outright. Brutalities were performed by both sides on both the Native Americans as well as the settlers. Here we see a map of French, British, and Spanish claims. Now we're mostly concerned here with the French and British claims, and blue being French, red being British. Now we see a disputed territory, which is both blue as well as red, and this is where the French and Indian War will have its origins, particularly at the highlighted fort called Fort Duquesne. Here we see an atypical event during the French and Indian War. This is the famous or infamous Deerfield Massacre. This took place in winter. Warfare was very, very uncommon during the winter because of the problems associated with traveling at this time of year. Therefore, the colonials' guard was down, and French soldiers, as well as Native Americans, invaded Deerfield, Massachusetts. Although some survived and held out, many were killed on the spot, many were captured, some were killed on the trip back to Canada, and many were held for hostage and eventually did come home upon payment of ransom. This is a very famous print by Benjamin Franklin, a famous printer and later patriot and founding father. In this picture, Franklin shows that the American colonies should join together against the French, or you can see what he's saying the result would be. Here we see a replica of a French fort in the wilderness, and this would be very typical of French as well as British forts, European forts during the time period. If you were to attack a fort like this, you can see you'd have to overcome many obstacles, only some of which are obvious in this picture. But attacking troops could be fired on 3 different sides. It was a very difficult fortification to conquer. This particular fort was one called Fort Duquesne, which no longer exists. It's today in what would be called Pittsburgh. And here's a young American by the name of George Washington. 21-year-old Washington was sent to Fort Duquesne to tell the British to exit the Ohio Valley, which the British claimed. Of course, the French claimed it too, and you can imagine just probably what the French told George Washington. But when he went to deliver his message, George Washington and a small contingent of British and colonial troops fired on a French scouting party, killing the leader of the French scouting party, whose brother was actually the commander of Fort Duquesne. This is often seen as the spark that had ignited the final war, French and Indian War, and caused the loss of all of French Canada to the British Empire. Here's the fort that Washington built when he was attacked by the French coming out from Fort Duquesne. The name of it is Fort Necessity, and you can see that this thing was thrown up very, very quickly. Of course, it didn't protect Washington nor his troops from the French and Native American allies. Washington would surrender. He was allowed to go home, but he signed a piece of paper which, in effect, unknowing to Washington, since it was in French, said the blame was all of Washington's. So France was able to blame England for the start of the French and Indian War. The British sent over this gentleman, a General Braddock, who came to fight against the French with highly trained British troops in the frontier of North America. This general was somewhat arrogant. He ignored the advice given to him by Ben Franklin, among other colonials, as the warfare in this continent would be very different than warfare back in Europe. Braddock ignored the advice. Braddock had a slow advancing column cutting a road through the forest, heading towards Fort Duquesne. His advance was very closely monitored by Native Americans. And finally, before he arrived at Fort Duquesne, an elaborate ambush was staged. The result was a tremendous defeat of the British, the colonial troops, and Braddock himself. Very bloody fighting in the battle, and Braddock received a mortal wound. Here's an artist rendering of what his death probably looked like. He died at the battlefield. Here's the retreat along the road that they had previously constructed. Braddock died and was actually buried in the road, so any trace of his body would be covered up. Now, the defeat of the British in Braddock had wide-reaching ramifications. Many Native Americans, not sure of which side to join, looked at the silly tactics, the inept ability of the British Army, decided to join the French, as well as many other reasons. The British had mainly the Iroquois Indians that sided with them. This is a typical blockhouse of the day. It was a building designed for defense. It was very difficult for anyone to capture or even burn. It could be fired on. You could be fired on by many different directions. No windows in it. It was a very secure fortification. And here we have the famous Roberts Rangers. Now these are mostly colonials, or what you would call Americans. You can see their distinctive green coats. These were men, young men, all strong, hand-picked, raised on the frontier. These were very woods-wise frontiersmen that were very, very effective troops used by the British, but they were almost consistently almost all what we would call Americans or colonials. And here we have Native Americans on the frontier in their villages. Don't particularly know which tribe this would be. I would guess perhaps Iroquois. If you look in the background, you can see the longhouses, which would be typical of the Iroquois. And these particular tribes would side with the British. They were almost hereditary enemies of the French. They carried a great hatred of the French from their first contact with them. Here you see a typical brave of the period painted. Obviously trying here and achieving what he's trying to do look very fierce. Very effective warriors, skilled at guerrilla warfare. Not very effective in warfare in the open field. The British would definitely hold the edge in that type of warfare. Here you see another picture of Native Americans. Wouldn't know the particular tribe here. More pictures of Native Americans, this one going into battle. These men were trained from childhood to be warriors. It was probably one of the greatest things that they could aspire to be. And the British fortunes were, they were not doing very well when the French and Indian War began, as we explained, with Braddock's defeat. Until in England, Prime Minister Pitt came to power, the youngest Prime Minister in the history of Great Britain, even to this day. He decided that the main theater to be won was in North America, and he spent whatever it would take to be able to defeat the French in North America. This had enormous ramifications for the American Revolution. The debt that was incurred by the French and Indian War would lead to increased taxation in the American colonies, which would be a major contributing factor to the American Revolution. This fort is called Fort Louisbourg, which was considered the absolute essential key to defeating French Canada. This was a gigantic fort built in what's present-day Nova Scotia, and it guarded the approach to the St. Lawrence River, which was the heart and soul of French Canada. The fort was so large that Louis XIV, upon spending enormous amounts of money, said that he should be able to look over the ocean from France and be able to see it. The fort was attacked by a combined British and colonial force, which was able to defeat the fort. It was blown up as well as burned. This is a reconstruction which the Canadian government has spent a great deal of money to rebuild. Louisbourg is right here on the island of Cape Breton, which belongs to Nova Scotia. As you can see, it guards the approach to the St. Lawrence River, which is where Quebec, Montreal, and the heart of New France. The deciding battle of the war would have been at Quebec. On the Plains of Abraham, which you see right here, is the deciding battle of the French-Indian War. Upon the cliff, you would see the French fort. Fortification was directed towards the river. The French never even considered that there could ever be attack from the land side. As you can see here, there is a cliff which was considered just unapproachable from this, from the river. But the British, in an amazing turn of events, discovered a way up the cliff. They came down the river, past the French guns, and in the middle of the night were able to get a force large enough on the land side of Quebec to attack on the Plains of Abraham. There's another picture of this. It's a heroic story of the British Army, and very popular in fiction and in song at the time. Here's another picture of this, probably the most well-known picture of the British coming up the fort on the land side of Fort Quebec. Interesting thing, the British winter was approaching, and there was no way the British Navy could have remained in the St. Lawrence River during winter, so it was a make-or-break attempt. And here's the commander, the victorious commander, General Wolfe, who actually is shown dying in this battle, the Battle of Quebec. It was said, as he was laid dying at the battle, upon hearing that they were victorious, he said that he would die in peace. Here's the French commander, the Marquis de Montcalm, a very gifted soldier for France. He also was killed in the same battle. Both commanders were killed in the Battle of Quebec. To this day, if you look at the license plates of the people of Quebec, it says Je me souviens, which basically means we remember. They remember their French heritage and culture. Now, here you see the numerous French forts throughout Michigan, which was part of French Canada, throughout the Ohio Valley, Louisiana, and all of these forts would not have to be attacked. When Quebec was defeated on the St. Lawrence River, supplies and men and equipment were not able to be delivered to these forts. And this next picture, where you see a bunch of grapes, the analogy would be if you cut the stem on the base of these grapes, the nutrients and water wouldn't be able to go to the grapes, and one by one they would die. This is what happened to the French forts. When Quebec was defeated and the St. Lawrence River was closed to the French, one by one the French forts would have to surrender without even a military assault. And thereby the French and Indian War comes to an end. And remember, kids, the most important thing as far as we're concerned here is that the cost of this war was enormous, and taxation upon the colonials, upon Americans, would be increased, one of the major factors leading to the American Revolution.